Ancient societies ran on work most people preferred to ignore. Hidden behind temples and markets were laborers who handled the filth, danger, and unpleasant tasks that kept daily life functioning. These are their stories. Life in the ancient world wasn't just about kings, soldiers, and merchants. Behind the scenes, societies relied on people doing some of the strangest, dirtiest, and most dangerous jobs imaginable. So for today's video, we're going to take a look at 15 of the grossest ancient jobs. Starting with 15, the ancient night soil collectors. One of the foulest but very real jobs in the ancient world was that of the night soil collector. In societies without modern sewage systems, human waste piled up pretty quick in cesspits, chamber pots, and communal latrines. Someone had to remove it, and this fell to people who made their living hauling away excrement. Practice is known from several civilizations, but records from ancient China and ancient Rome stand out. In China, officials in large cities hired workers to collect human waste during the night when the streets were quieter and the smell was less likely to offend. This waste, once collected, was not simply thrown away, it was recycled as fertilizer for agriculture. The demand was so constant, since urban populations produced huge volumes of it daily. Farmers valued the material so much that in some areas it was even called gold manure because of its importance, though for the collectors themselves it was dirty and degrading work. In Rome, similar duties existed, though the infrastructure was a bit more advanced, thanks to sewers like the Cloaca Maximum. Even so, public latrines filled up and workers sometimes had to shovel and transport waste manually. Conditions were not only disgusting, but they were dangerous. The buildup of methane and hydrogen sulfide in cesspits would suffocate people, and without protective equipment, entering the spaces meant risking your life. Collectors were paid poorly and carried a strong social stigma. Handling human waste placed them near the bottom of any social hierarchies, similar to tanners and executioners, yet their work was essential. Without them, ancient cities would have faced overwhelming sanitation crises, disease outbreaks, and unbearable living conditions. This job is one of the clearest examples of how the ancient world depended on people willing to do revolting tasks. 14 Roman fullers. Laundry workers in urine vats. If there was one profession in ancient Rome that matched both the necessity and disgust, it was the fuller's trade. Fullers were responsible for cleaning and processing clothing, but instead of using soap, they relied on human urine as their main cleaning agent. Urine is rich in ammonia. It was collected in jars set out on city streets and then carted off to the laundries. There, fullers would mix it with water in large vats and stomp the dirty clothes with their feet, much like grapes being crushed in winemaking. Process was effective at removing grease and stains, but it was grueling and unpleasant. Fullers often spent long hours standing knee-deep in the foul-smelling liquid, physically agitating garments to get them clean. Inscriptions and graffiti from ancient Pompeii confirm the existence of these fullicine, and archaeologists have uncovered well-preserved remains of these workshops, complete with the vats and basins used for that work. Fullers were sometimes mocked in Roman literature for their smell and lowly status. Still though, trade was essential since Rome was a city of over 1 million people at its height, and there was a constant demand for clean togas, tunics, and linens. The job was so widespread that Emperor Vespasian's famous urine tax of the 1st century CE was largely aimed at that industry. Though it was one of the dirtiest and most unpleasant jobs in Rome, being a fuller was necessary for the functioning of urban life. It also shows how ancient societies used every available resource, even those most people would rather ignore. The legacy of the fullers survives not just in the texts but in the archaeological remains of their workshop, where the echoes of that grim but vital profession can still be seen today. 13 Ancient tanners. Among the most unpleasant but vital jobs in the ancient world, this was the process of turning raw animal hide into durable, workable leather. From Mesopotamia to Rome and later throughout medieval Europe, leather was essential for daily life. It was used for clothing, armor, footwear, belts, saddles, water containers, and countless other tools. But behind every leather product was the work of tanners, who toiled in some of the foulest conditions. Process started with freshly skinned animal hides, often from cattle, sheep, or goats. These hides, still covered in blood, fat, and hair, had to be scraped clean. Workers would use knives to cut away flesh and connective tissue, a messy task that often left scraps of rotting meat behind. The hides were then soaked in vats filled with mixtures designed to break them down and prepare them for preservation. These mixtures frequently included water mixed with animal dung or human urine. The ammonia in the urine acted as a natural chemical agent which loosened the hair fibers, while the enzymes in dung softened the hides. Now, tanners just didn't simply leave the hides in those vats, they worked with them directly, and in many places they stood barefoot in the liquid, stomping and kneading the skins to help the process along. The smell was overpowering, a mix of decaying flesh and ammonia. Yeah, ancient and medieval writers often remarked on the stench of tanneries, and archaeological sites confirmed that tanners were usually forced to operate on the outskirts of towns so their smell wouldn't pollute the air of the crowded center. After soaking, the hides were then stretched on frames and then scraped again to remove the loosened hair and residual tissue. The final stage involved soaking the hides in solutions that contained tannins. Those are naturally occurring compounds found in tree bark and certain plants that stabilize the hides, preventing decay and making them more flexible. But the labor part? That was far from over. The hides had to be worked, stretched, and dried over many days, all of which required the tanner's constant attention. Tanning was a profession that sat at the intersection of necessity and revulsion. Without tanners, ancient societies would have lacked one of their most versatile materials. Yet those who did the work lived with the stigma of a trade that everyone relied on but no one wanted to be near. 12 Roman sewage workers. So, one of the least enviable jobs in the Roman Empire was that of the sewage worker. Rome's advanced urban infrastructure is often praised in the history books, the aqueducts, the paved roads, the monumental baths, but less attention is given to the people who had to maintain the city's massive sewage systems, especially the Cloaca Maxima, one of the earliest large-scale drains. Cloaca Maxima, originally built around the 6th century BCE under the orders of King Tarquinius, was designed to drain marshland and remove waste from the growing city. By the height of the empire, it carried not just storm water, but also the refuse of countless public latrines. The Romans were proud of their sanitation system, but it didn't run itself. Workers had to keep the sewers clear of blockages and ensure the flow of waste through the system. The job was filthy and hazardous, and workers had to descend down into the underground tunnels, often crawling through narrow passages filled with stagnant waste. They carried torches or oil lamps to see in the pitch darkness, though the flames sometimes competed with the dangerous gases. Methane and hydrogen sulfide built up in the enclosed spaces, which created risks of suffocation or even explosion. Rats and insects thrived down there in the sewers, making the environment even more unpleasant. Slaves and convicts were often assigned to this work, though some free laborers took it on for pay. The smell alone was a constant companion. Clung to the workers and marked them socially. Ancient satirical writers sometimes mocked those who associated with the sewers, painting them as living embodiments of filth. Despite the dangers, the work was essential to Rome. The public latrines of Rome, which dozens at a time, emptied directly into them. Without workers to clear blockages, waste would back up into the streets, spreading disease and undermining the public health. Some archaeological evidence of the Cloaca Maxima shows just how massive and sophisticated it was. Stone-lined tunnels were large enough in places for a person to walk upright, and some sections remain intact today. Yet, while the structure itself is often celebrated, the nameless workers who labored there are largely forgotten. 11 Professional mourners in ancient Egypt and Rome. Among the more unsettling jobs in the ancient world were professional mourners, individuals that were hired to cry, wail, and perform grief during funerals. In cultures like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later Rome, death was a highly ritualized event. Mourning wasn't just a personal expression of loss, it was a social duty. The scale of grief demonstrated at a funeral reflected the importance of the deceased. For this reason, wealthy families often paid people, usually women, to cry loudly, beat their chests, tear at their clothing, and carefully choreograph displays of sorrow. Scenes painted on tomb walls show groups of women standing beside the body, their arms raised, their hair loose, and tears streaming as they performed laments. The more extravagant the display of grief, the greater the honor to thee and the more secure their passage to the next world was believed to be. In Rome, professional mourners called preface were equally important in funeral rites. Writers like Seneca and Cicero mentioned them, often with disdain, criticizing their practice as excessive or insincere. These women would wail, sing dirges, and sometimes scratch their faces or smear ashes on themselves to heighten a sense of tragedy. The sounds they made could be heard throughout the neighborhoods, and it signaled a funeral procession. The more mourners a family could afford, the more respected the funeral appeared. Though the job might sound strange today, it was steady work for many poor women. Families expected dramatic outpourings of grief, but not everyone could summon such displays naturally. The mourners then filled that gap, ensuring the funeral met community expectations. But professional mourners had to move from funeral to funeral, enacting grief for people they had never known. This repetitive exposure to death, combined with theatrical wailing, created a bleak cycle that carried a social stigma. Some Roman writers mocked them for being insincere or actresses of grief, yet their presence shows how different ancient societies viewed death. The mourners' cries were thought to please the gods, soothe the family, and keep proper order in the rituals of burial. While modern audiences might find the role unsettling or even grotesque, in antiquity it was both necessary and highly valued. 10 ancient bug removers for royalty. In many ancient courts, royalty and nobles had attendants whose tasks went well beyond cooking or cleaning. One of the strangest and most unpleasant was the manual removal of insects and parasites from the bodies of kings, queens, and other elites. Before modern medicine and hygiene, lice, fleas, and bedbugs were constant companions, even in palaces. To protect the dignity of rulers, servants were tasked with removing these pests by hand. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, records and depictions show attendants grooming rulers not only by combing hair and arranging clothing, but also by checking for pests. Ancient combs discovered in tombs, including the famous ivory comb from Canaan inscribed with the words, "May this tusk root out lice of the hair and beard." They prove just how real and persistent the problem was. For a king or high priest, it would have been unthinkable to deal with lice themselves. That duty fell to low-ranking servants whose job was to search through hair and beards, pick out lice, and crush them. In China, too, written sources and art reveal that imperial servants often had to perform grooming tasks, including pest control. This work all carried a stigma. They placed the servant in constant, intimate contact with the ruler's body, but without any respect given to higher attendants like scribes or cupbearers. Bug removers were treated as lowly, meant replaceable, their job hidden in the background of court life. Yet they were indispensable. Left untreated, infestations could spread quickly through the entire household. While this job is rarely described in detail by ancient writers, likely because it was considered too undignified to record, archaeological finds of lice-infested combs and references in grooming texts confirm that people were employed for it. Yeah, their work was unglamorous, humiliating, and unsanitary, but it helped keep the powerful free from one of the most irritating problems of daily life. 9 salt miners at Holstad, Austria. Bronze and Iron Age, one of the dirtiest and most grueling jobs of the ancient world was salt mining. The Holstad region of Austria, famous today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was home to some of the oldest known salt mines in the world, dating back to at least 1200 BCE. Salt was extremely valuable in antiquity, and it preserved food, seasonal meals, and served as a trade commodity so important that it was sometimes referred to as white gold, but the process of extracting it was anything but glamorous. Excavations in Holstad have uncovered wooden tools, leather sacks, torches, and even miners' clothing preserved by the salt itself. The miners, often young men, were required to dig deep into the mountains with simple tools like antler picks and wooden shovels. Once extracted, the blocks have had to be hauled to the surface in heavy packs, sometimes weighing more than 30 kilograms. This work was physically exhausting and often carried out in cold, damp tunnels lit only by primitive lamps. Dust from the salt irritated your skin and lungs, and the tunnels could collapse, and of course, oxygen was limited. One famous discovery in the 18th century was the body of a prehistoric miner preserved in salt, his clothing and tools still intact after more than 2,000 years. This find showed just how perilous this occupation could be. The mines of Holstad demonstrate how a job both dirty and dangerous could underpin the prosperity of a civilization. Their work was essential, but their lives were defined by hardship, danger, and a constant battle with the underground world. 8. Ancient leech collectors. Before modern medicine, bloodletting was one of the most widespread treatments in the ancient world, and leeches were among the most important tools for the practice. In Greece, Rome, India, China, and later medieval Europe, leeches were thought to rebalance the body's humors and cure ailments ranging from fevers to headache. But to make this possible, someone had to collect the leeches, and that was a job as disgusting as it was dangerous. Collectors usually worked in marshes, ponds, and swamps where leeches thrived. The simplest and most common method was to wade barefoot or with legs exposed into shallow water, allowing the leeches to attach themselves to your skin. Once enough had latched on, the collector would pull them off, sometimes peeling them away with fingernails or scraping them with knives. Yeah, the process was painful, since the leeches fed by piercing the skin and secreting anticoagulants, which kept the blood flowing even after they were removed. This job was hazardous. Repeated bites could lead to excessive bleeding, infections, and ulcers. In some cases, collectors developed chronic anemia from the blood loss, but still the demand was high. Physicians across the ancient world used leeches in huge numbers, and they were considered valuable trade goods. By the Roman period, leeches were being transported across regions to supply medical markets, and collectors formed the bottom rung of this lucrative trade. Archaeological finds of jars designed to hold leeches, along with references in medical texts like those of Galen, confirm how widespread that practice was. The collectors themselves, though, remained largely invisible in the historical record. Their labor was both unpleasant and invisible, which supported a medical system that often overlooked the suffering of those at its margins. It was a job that epitomized the paradox of ancient labor, necessary, repulsive, and almost entirely forgotten. 7. Ancient toilet attendants. So, public toilets were a common feature in large cities of the ancient world, especially in Rome, where dozens of communal latrines served the needs of a population well over 1 million. These facilities were sophisticated for their time, with stone benches lined with holes and flowing water channels underneath to carry waste into the sewers. But behind the convenience lay one of the most unpleasant jobs in antiquity, the latrine attendant. Toilets required constant upkeep. Waste had to be cleared when blockages happened, benches scrubbed, and water channels kept flowing. Attendants were tasked with ensuring that the facilities didn't become unusable. One of their strangest duties involved the tersorium, a communal sponge on a stick used in toilet paper. Users would dip the sponge in running water after use, but attendants often had to manage the supply, clean the sponges, or even fetch fresh ones. Roman writers sometimes mocked the indignity of this practice, but archaeological finds of sponges and latrine structures confirm its reality. Despite this stigma, though, the role was essential. Without the attendants, Rome's public toilets, so often celebrated as examples of Roman engineering, would have quickly become unusable. Graffiti on some latrine walls even hints at the presence of workers, as complaints and jokes scratched into the plaster mention the smells and the state of cleanliness. Toilet attendants lived with the lowest of social standing, associated with filth and shame. They were often slaves or the poorest laborers, invisible to society except when their absence was felt in the overflowing latrines. Their labor made city life possible for everyone else, and it was a job that combined humiliation, danger, and necessity. That's an occupation no one wanted, but all depended upon. 6. The ancient copper smelter. Another dirty and dangerous job in the ancient world was copper smelting. As early as 3000 BCE, societies in the Near East, Central Europe, and China were producing copper on a large scale, which fueled the Bronze Age with tools, weapons, and ornaments. But smelting copper was one of the most hazardous occupations. This process required heating copper ore in furnaces until it reached high temperature, often above 1000 degrees Celsius, and workers fed the fires with charcoal, bellows, and constant attention, enduring blistering heat and smoke. The ore itself contained arsenic and other toxic minerals. When heated, those released poisonous fumes. Evidence from sites like Timna in Israel and Rudiglava in Serbia shows the remains of smelting furnaces, slag heaps, and even human burials that suggest the toll the work took. Analysis of ancient miners' and smelters' bones revealed elevated levels of heavy metal, confirming long-term exposure. The workers carried the health costs of an industry that underpinned the power of an entire civilization. Socially, they were rarely celebrated, even though their labor made possible advances in warfare, agriculture, and trade. Their work was grueling, hauling or maintaining furnaces and laboring in extreme heat. Smelters faced constant risk of injury from molten metal splashes and furnace collapses. The smelter's job combined dirt, danger, and low status, yet it literally forged the materials of civilization. Without their willingness to inhale fumes and risk burns of these ancient furnaces, the technological leaps of the Bronze Age would not have been possible. 5 Ancient dung collectors. In many ancient societies, one of the lowest but most essential jobs was collecting animal dung. While the task, of course, was smelly and degrading, dung was a valuable resource. It was used as fertilizer to enrich fields, fuel for fires in regions where wood was scarce, and even as a building material when mixed with clay. But before it could be used, someone had to gather it. In Egypt, huge herds of cattle were kept along the Nile, and dung was a key part of farming life. Workers scooped it from animal enclosures, dried it in the sun, and carried it in baskets to fields or storage pits. Evidence shows that dried dung cakes were burned in household stoves, providing a steady source of heat and cooking fuel. So yeah, the job was unpleasant. Collectors waded through animal pens, scooping fresh piles with simple tools or even by hand. And of course, the smell was overwhelming, and flies and other insects were constant companions. Yet their role was essential for sustaining food production, cooking, and just daily life. In Egypt, it was mixed with clay to strengthen mud bricks, which formed the bulk of the ancient constructions there. In South Asia, dried cow dung was sometimes used as plaster for walls, providing insulation. And those practices still found in some rural communities today show how widespread and practical dung use was in antiquity. The work was hot, dirty, and stigmatized, but it provided the foundation for agriculture and domestic life in many early civilizations. Dung collectors are a reminder that some of the unpleasant jobs in history were also the most indispensable. For medieval treadmill operators. Before modern machinery, some of the heaviest labor in medieval and earlier societies was powered not by animals, water, or wind, but by people. One of the strangest jobs was that of the treadmill operator, men who walked for hours inside giant wooden wheels, turning them like living cogs in a machine. These wheels were connected to cranes, mills, and lifting devices, especially in castle construction and cathedral building. Archaeological reconstructions and surviving records from Europe show how tread wheels raised enormous stones high into the air. The workers, often peasants or prisoners, climbed inside and began walking, their weight turning the wheel and powering the crane. Of course, the job was repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous. But unlike exercise treadmills, these wheels were several meters wide, with room for 1 or 2 men at a time. Constant walking would strain your legs and joints while the enclosed wooden structure became hot, stuffy, and slippery with sweat. A slip inside the wheel could sometimes mean broken bones or even your death. Socially, treadmill operators were considered expendable labor. Their role required no skill beyond endurance and strength, but the work was critical. Cathedrals, castles, and fortifications had to rely on the invisible labor of men walking endlessly inside wheels, lifting blocks that weighed tons. Though this job is most associated with the Middle Ages, a similar human-powered wheel existed earlier in Greece and Rome. Vitruvius, a Roman engineer, described cranes powered by men walking inside wheels to raise heavy loads. It's just that continuity shows how essential and unpleasant that form of labor was across the centuries. Yet their job is an example of how human muscle was literally the engine that drove some of the ancient and medieval world's most impressive achievements. 3 Ancient food tasters. Throughout history, rulers have faced one constant threat: assassination by poison. In cultures across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia and Persia to Greece, Rome, India, and China, poisoning was a genuine fear at royal courts. It was silent, invisible, and effective, making it one of the easiest ways to eliminate a powerful figure without a battle or open confrontation. To defend themselves against this invisible threat, rulers turned to a peculiar and perilous profession, the food taster. The job of a food taster was pretty simple in theory but deeply unsettling in practice. Before a ruler ate or drank anything, the food taster sampled it first. If the taster fell ill, collapsed, or died, the ruler avoided the fate intended for them. This turned the taster into a living shield, their health and life used as the ultimate test of safety. Emperor Claudius, who is believed to have been killed by poison in 54 CE, had a taster named Helotus. Ironically, Helotus himself was suspected by some of either failing in his duty or perhaps colluding with those who poisoned Claudius' mushrooms. The fact that historians still debate the episode underscores how central food tasters were to palace intrigue. The risk wasn't just physical either, it was psychological too. Living daily with the possibility of death would have weighed heavily on anyone. Tasters were both trusted and expendable, valued enough to stand between the ruler and danger, but easily sacrificed if something went wrong. This ambiguous status shaped their social position. In Rome, tasters were often freedmen or slaves, chosen because their loyalty was either bought or enforced. They lived close to the emperor, sharing meals and sometimes quarters, but they were never equals. Their proximity to power was paired with constant danger. Archaeological evidence for the profession is harder to identify than textual references, since the role left little physical trace. However, ancient dining halls, kitchens, and banquet spaces show how elaborate preparation and serving of meals could be. In places like Pompeii, frescoes depict banquets with multiple attendants, some of whom may have been tasters or cupbearers. In Persia and China, court records describe strict hierarchies of kitchen staff, with tasters explicitly included. These descriptions confirm that the role was institutionalized, not a rare or ad hoc appointment. Taster job embodied the extreme lengths that societies would go to preserve their leaders, even at the cost of another person's life. In modern times, the idea of the food taster does survive mostly as a curiosity, sometimes revived in popular culture or ceremonial practice. For example, in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler reportedly employed food tasters during World War II, fearing assassination by poison. But in antiquity, it wasn't an eccentric habit, it was a normalized, institutionalized job. Ultimately, their job stands as a weird job in the ancient world. It was a position of immense trust and yet of complete disposability. Few jobs better illustrate the extremes of life in ancient courts, where survival depended not just on armies and politics, but on the bite of a single mouthful of food. 2 ancient cesspit divers. So of all the unpleasant occupations out there in the medieval world, few were as revolting as the job of the cesspit diver. Long before modern sewage treatment systems, cities relied on cesspits to hold human waste. These pits, dug beneath houses, inns, and public buildings, served as collection chambers for excrement, urine, and refuse. Once they filled, someone had to descend into them and haul the contents out by hand. It was a job that combined filth with mortal risk, and yet without it, large cities couldn't function. Cesspits were common throughout the Roman Empire, in medieval Europe, and in ancient urban centers elsewhere in the world. Excavations in places like York, London, Paris, and Rome have all uncovered hundreds of these pits, still often containing layers of compacted waste. These finds show not only what people ate, but also the scale of the problem that cesspit divers faced. A pit could hold a year's worth of accumulation, a dense mass that hardened over time but gave off toxic fumes as it rotted. Divers were typically lowered into these pits by a rope or climbed down crude ladders. They carried buckets, scoops, or even used their bare hands to fill containers with sludge. Once a bucket was full, it was hauled back up and dumped into carts or barrels. This recycling of filth gave cesspit divers a role in agriculture as well as some urban sanitation, though they received little respect for it. The work was incredibly dangerous. The biggest threat came from the gases that accumulated in the cesspit. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide built up in there, especially when the pit had little ventilation. Sometimes rescuers had to climb in after them and were overcome as well, leading to multiple deaths in a single incident. Modern experiments and enclosed cesspits have confirmed how quickly the air quality can deteriorate. To the people who did this work, it was an everyday hazard. Despite the risks, though, the job had to be done. In Rome, they worked alongside sewer cleaners who maintained the Cloaca Maxima, the massive drainage system that carried waste out of the city. But in the medieval world, where underground drainage was less developed, cesspit divers were even more common. Records from London in the 14th and 15th centuries describe gong firmers, the English term for a cesspit cleaner, who were hired by households or municipalities to empty pits at night. There are occasional references in texts as well. In medieval London, city ordinances regulated the work of gong firmers, requiring them to remove waste without spilling it in the streets. They were fined if they dumped contents improperly, and records show that they earned wages higher than some ordinary laborers, perhaps reflecting the dangerous nature of the job. In other cities, though, cesspit workers were slaves or convicts and forced into the task as punishment. This suggests that the work was universally despised, seen as a fate reserved for the desperate or the unlucky. When ancient pest controllers. Urban life in the ancient world brought prosperity, culture, and innovation, but it also brought pests. Wherever people gathered in large numbers, storing grain, keeping livestock, and living in close quarters, rats, mice, and insects followed. To protect the food supply and reduce disease, cities and wealthy households relied on people whose job it was to hunt, trap, and kill vermin. These ancient pest controllers worked in conditions that were dirty and dangerous, but their work was vital to the survival of the cities and empires. Evidence of pest control stretches back thousands of years. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written texts reference the problem of rodents destroying grain. Cuneiform tablets record priests praying to the gods to protect harvests from pests. But prayers alone were not enough. Laborers were tasked with physically removing rodents from storehouses and granaries. Archaeologists have found clay rat traps in ancient sites designed to lure and capture the rodents. The existence of these traps suggests that people were actively employed in setting, maintaining, and emptying them, a task as unpleasant as it was necessary. In ancient Egypt, where grain harvests along the Nile sustained the population and were stored in huge state granaries, the rodent problem was severe. Tomb paintings depict cats hunting mice and rats, showing that Egyptians understood the value of animals in controlling pests. But cats couldn't solve the problem alone. Human workers were needed to set traps, plug burrows, and clear out infested storage rooms. The physical toll on these pest controllers must have been severe. That grain dust caused chronic respiratory problems, rodent bites and scratches carried infections, and fleas spread fevers. Combined with poor pay and social exclusion, pest controllers live hard and often short lives. Looking back, it's easy to celebrate the achievements of ancient engineering, architecture, and culture, but none of those things would have endured without the dirty, dangerous work of those who fought a constant battle against vermin. Forgotten by history, despised in their own time, these pest controllers nevertheless played a role as vital as any general, politician, or even philosopher. Though rarely remembered, these workers carried the burden of civilization's dirtiest jobs. Their thankless labor shaped the world far more than history ever admits.